Okay, so before we start actually stepping through the code, I just wanted to briefly review, what are the salient points of the provider model. You've probably used a variety of provider-based features before in ASP.NET, and hopefully by now you've seen that it gives you the ability to turn on new functionality for any of the features and do it in a transparent fashion. So we took a number of the application services like membership and roles, profile, and personalization, and in essence, we refactored part of their functionality so that some portion of these services actually run as pluggable building blocks. And you know that we ship out of the box a number of default SQL providers and the Active Directory membership provider, but you can go out and write your own custom providers, extend what we've built, and plug in your own functionality. And the nice thing about it is you can do that in a transparent fashion. Part of the magic that makes this work is that we decoupled the functionality in the providers from the rest of the feature through configuration settings. And if you've ever had to muck around with, for example, web config, you know what I'm talking about, because there's a providers element with add, remove, clear sub elements where you can manipulate these specific providers that you actually want to use with the feature. Now, the nice thing about how all of this works is that the structural classes that make the provider model work for ASP.NET are all public, and they're all available for you to use in your own features. And that's basically the thrust of the demo that I've got set up and that I'm going to show all of you. So I've got running on my machine in Visual Studio a sample feature, and I call it the quotations feature, that has a provider layer to it. And basically, I want the ability to choose arbitrary providers and config that can provide a quote of the day on the website. Now, most of the code, though, in this project is specific to using the provider model, and it's basically a really good skeletal framework for seeing how to build out your own provider-based feature the same way we did in ASP.NET. Now, before I drill into it, I just want to real briefly switch over into Internet Explorer and let everyone know that we've got the sample code that I'm showing you here today available on our Provider Toolkit page. So if you go to MSDN, you go to the Provider Toolkit page, and if you scroll down a bit, down towards the bottom, you'll see there's a code template for building a provider-based feature. So the code that I'm stepping through here today with all of you is available for download, and you can pull it onto your own machine, make a couple of name changes and compile it up, and use it to jumpstart your own provider-based development. So back in the sample feature here, let's start out with what the feature looks like in configuration. So I have a quotations element here, which is sort of the top level element for the feature, and then inside of it, I want to have a provider sub element, much like we do for things like membership and role manager. And again, just like those provider-based features, I want to be able to add, remove, and clear configuration elements inside of them for one or more specific providers. So conceptually, this should look pretty familiar to those of you who've worked with other provider elements for other features. So what do you have to do as a developer to sort of have your own custom configuration section that works the same way? Well, it's pretty simple. You write your own configuration class, which in the 2.0 framework is pretty trivial. You just derive from the configuration section type, which is in the system.configuration namespace, and then you take advantage of a few built-in types that we provide for you. So you'll notice here I put in a public property called providers, and its purpose is to hold a programmatic representation of all of the provider elements in config. And it's typed with this provider settings collection class. And you'll notice that this class, it's public, it's inside of the system configuration namespace, and it has all of the logic necessary at runtime to automatically parse these kinds of elements and turn them into one or more instances of what's called a provider settings type, and then automatically store it inside of this property. The nice thing for you as a developer is you don't have to write all of the XML parsing or any of the conversion into the programmatic representation of this config info. You just derive from configuration section, add in one property, and make it this provider settings collection type. And then this configuration property attribute, this is standard for any kind of configuration section you write. It basically tells us in the framework at runtime that when we're parsing your config section and we see an element called providers, that we should invoke all of the functionality of this type to actually parse the config and turn it into a set of provider information. Now, the other thing I did in this class, just sort of for consistency, is I dropped in a public default provider property. So this is meant to mirror the stuff that you've seen in membership where you have a default provider attribute on your feature. And what I do here is, once again, I type it as a string because that's all it's set as inside of config. I have a configuration property attribute that tells us, hey, if you see default provider in the XML and web config, go set its value on this property. And then I also give it a default value. So this is sort of the same way our features work, where we default to using the SQL provider. And this is sort of how we set up that association. So it's a pretty straightforward class, pretty much boilerplate code that you put together. The next thing that I did is I built a provider collection. And what I did this time is I derived from the provider collection base class. Again, it's in the system configuration namespace in the provider sub namespace. And this collection type it's just sort of a little helper class that we have there that acts as a generic collection for holding one or more provider instances. And what you do when you write your own provider-based features, you derive from it, and then you just override a few methods basically to give it a typeful nature. So for example, in the add method, I'm just making sure that you can only add providers that are unique to this feature, right? So for example, I couldn't add a membership provider into this collection. And then similarly, you can see I have an indexer here, and really the only thing I'm doing is I'm making a typecast so that when you use the indexer to get a handle to a specific provider, that you get back the correct type. Again, pretty much boilerplate code, and like I said, if you download the project that's up on MSDN, literally you just go out and do a search and replace on this string and put in the type that you want, and you've automatically got a provider collection for your feature. The last thing I want to show you before I actually step through the code is the features provider-based class. So as you know, all provider-based features have some kind of base class that's specific to them. So there's a membership provider, there's a role provider, a profile provider, etc. And in this case, we have a quotations provider. The main thing is I'm deriving from the provider-based type. Again, it's a public class, it's up in the system configuration provider namespace, and all providers need to derive from it. The reason why is that we have code elsewhere in the framework that sort of treats providers in a common fashion, that in essence doesn't have any knowledge of any features specific provider implementation. And the reason why we can do that is that if all providers derive from provider base, then we know there's sort of a base level of functionality available no matter which feature we're dealing with. So these are sort of all the base classes that I've got. Now I've got a simple console application where I'm going to make use of this provider-based feature. And the reason why I'm going to step through the code from the point of view of a console application is that even though you hear a lot about the ASP.NET provider model or ASP.NET providers, the reality is all of the classes I've been showing you, like the provider collection, the provider base type, the provider settings collection, none of them are actually specific to ASP.NET. All of them work outside of web applications. So you can build your own provider-based feature inside of a console app, a WinForms app, or an NT service, and all the types are available for you. So you're not just limited to web scenarios. So we'll start up the application, and in the first line of code, I'm going to end up breaking into a static feature class. Now, if you've used things like membership, you know that there's a static class called membership, coincidentally with the exact same name as the feature. So I did the same thing here. I just created a static feature class and I called it quote manager. I implemented a static constructor that calls into a private initializer. This is basically the same general approach that all of the ASP.NET provider-based features take. The salient point being that each feature needs to be initialized once and only once, and it needs to be initialized on a single thread of execution. And here I'm taking advantage of static construction in the framework to give me those guarantees. From a coding perspective, you'll see that the first line of code, I'm getting a hold of that quotations configuration. So I'm just using the built-in configuration manager that's part of the .NET framework, and I'm telling it, hey, in config, get me the programmatic representation of that quotations element and return it to me as a strongly typed configuration class. And now that I've got it, I can actually code against it. So I do some simple checks. Like here, you can see we've got the default provider. And over here, we're making sure of the fact that there actually is at least one provider defined in config. And then after that, I go into a few lines of code that are basically the core of bootstrapping any provider-based feature. So a lot of folks, they sort of look at membership and they wonder, well, I have a bunch of add elements where I'm defining various providers and somehow magically at runtime, these providers are available. Well, guess what? These next three lines of code are effectively the magic that makes that happen. We start out with that provider collection class that I showed you earlier. So we have an empty collection, and then we make use of another public type that's available to all of you, and it's called Providers Helper. Now, in this case, Providers Helper happens to be in the System Web configuration namespace. Even though it's under System Web configuration, trust me, you can use it in your own apps outside of ASP.NET. And again, that's why I'm stepping through a console application here to sort of show to all of you that the type is available outside of ASP.NET. The really cool thing about this type is it's got a nice helper method, a static method called Instantiate Providers. And this method encapsulates all of the work that's necessary to take the configuration information about providers and give you back one or more concrete instances of those providers. So if we look at what gets passed in, you can see we have our empty provider collection. You can see over here we have our quotations configuration type. So this is the programmatic collection of provider information that was derived from the add elements in config. And then we have a type object that just tells the helper class, you know, when you're spinning up the providers, make sure they actually conform to this type. And then what happens underneath the hood is that for each provider element that was defined in config, the provider's helper will new it up and will also initialize it. And you'll see that when I hit F10, I've broken into another initialize method, in this case, on a concrete implementation of my features provider type. And what's happening is the provider's helper basically said, oh, okay, there was an add element for one of these providers, so I'll go new it up for you. And then because you derived from provider base, and I overrode the initialize method on provider base, the provider's helper type said, well, guess what? I'm going to go out and initialize that provider. And so now I'm just going through some standard initialization logic for this provider. And the important thing is rather early on, I call into the initialize method on the provider base type. And that's another reason why all feature providers ultimately need to derive from the provider base type, because it has an initialize method that protects against double initialization. So for example, if you've ever taken a SQL membership provider instance inside of your ASP.NET app, and if you try to call the initialize method on it just in the middle of the page, you'll get an error. And the reason why is all of our providers follow this convention of calling into provider base to get that protection. So now that you've sort of seen the basics of what goes inside the initialize method, I'll just continue through in the debugger, and you'll see this time around we once again landed on a breakpoint in the initialize method for the static quotations provider type. The reason why is, remember, in app config for this console app, I had two provider add elements. So the provider's helper type is now iterating over the second piece of config information, newing up a second provider, and again initializing it. So I'll just quickly run through that. And now we're back in the breakpoint here inside of the static feature class. So by this point, Instantiate Providers has succeeded. If we take a look at our provider collection, you'll notice that now instead of actually being empty, the count of items in it is 2. So the provider's helper successfully spun up one instance of a provider for each add element in config. And then we went ahead and we flipped the read-only attribute on the collection. And this is the same kind of thing we do in the ASP.NET provider-based features. You'll notice that after the feature has initialized, you can no longer add or remove providers in the provider collection for that feature. Now that I've spun up all the providers, I just do some other quick bookkeeping where I store off a reference to the default provider, because again, the idea is since it's a static feature class, I should be able to just call into the class without selecting a provider. Now when I step through in the debugger, you'll see we finally land in the original method I was trying to call, which was getQuoteOfTheDay, and it's a static method sitting on my static feature class. Just like we do with the ASP.NET provider-based features, what we really do underneath the hood is we get a reference to the default provider, as you can see here, and then we turn around and forward the method call to the appropriate method on the provider implementation. So now I'm inside of the code for the specific provider. I'm inside of its implementation of the method that was defined on the quotations provider base class, and I return back some text. We'll just step through that, and then you can see here in the console, sure enough, the provider outputs some information for us. And then the second line of code that I just wanted, or the second piece of code to step through real quickly here, this is just an alternative way of working with providers. Now that I've made use of all the underlying provider types, I have access to my provider collection, and that means I can get a hold of a non-default provider. And in this case, when I get that reference and make the method call on it, you'll see I go directly into the concrete provider. I'm now bypassing the static feature class. And then I just invoke the method on that directly. And again, you see there's a second line of text that comes up in the console app. So that's a quick walkthrough of how you can write your own provider-based feature. We've seen here how you can start out in config with your own provider's element, and we've seen how it's very simple to then define a configuration class that takes advantage of the provider settings collection type to parse that information at runtime. And then we've also seen how inside of our static feature class, we're able to take advantage of the provider's helper method to convert from all of that configuration information and get back one or more instantiated provider references for us to use. So just in closing, it may look like there's a fair amount of code floating around, but again, remember, up on the MSDN site, just download the code template. It's literally got the exact same code that I was just showing you here, and should be pretty straightforward for you to tweak that up and make use of it in your own provider-based features.